Hello, welcome to Image Bearers. My name is Otoma Edje. I'm very excited to have on the program today Mandy Smith. We are going to get into some great conversation about a book that she has written. For those of you that are joining Image Bearers for the first time, this is a video podcast designed to help us better understand the scriptures, human nature, and history as we strive to honor God with our lives. And with every episode, we try to have some fun and build family in the process. So, as I mentioned, our special guest is Mandy Smith. She is the author, most recently, of Unfettered. She has written a number of other books, one of which is The Vulnerable Pastor, which I definitely want to get to at some point in the near future. And her most recent book, as I mentioned, is Unfettered. The subtitle is Imagining a Childlike Faith Beyond the Baggage of Western Culture. It's an awesome, awesome book with an awesome, awesome guest today. So Mandy grew up in Brisbane, Australia, and after living and ministering in the United Kingdom and the US, she's happy to be back in Australia and serving the church at St. Lucia. Before joining St. Lucia Uniting, she served as pastor at University Christian Church in Ohio. Mandy is an author and an artist, which is really cool, and loves exploring the ways that God is working in everything. Mandy and her husband, Jamie, who is a New Testament professor, live in a home where the teapot is always warm. So welcome to the program.
Yes, it's so good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Well, we're going to just go ahead and dive right in. So can you please share a little bit about yourself and also what led you to write this awesome book?
Yeah, well, I was actually listening to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe last night, reading it with a young woman in my congregation. And I can't even remember how many times I've read it before, but as I was listening to it, I was remembering my first reading of it and kind of visiting my younger self and remembering the conversation that the children have with the professor where he says, what if it's possible that we live in a world where there really could be other worlds hidden in cupboards and wardrobes around the place, and remembering that sense in my spirit when I was a little girl, just loving the fact that a grown-up was okay with that and that there could be a real serious world where those things really did happen. And beyond even the sense of fairy tales and fantasy, I think it's a theological yearning too, that there really are things happening that we can't see or understand. And in a way, that's what Scripture promises us, that we have to long for such things. And so I found myself kind of remembering that's who I've always been, and that's who God invites all of us to be. And so I think as grown-ups, we're often feel like that's just foolishness. But I do believe that was behind a lot of the writing of Unfettered, trusting that maybe those yearnings, and C.S. Lewis, as a very grown-up, serious person, talked specifically about longing and about desiring joy and having this sense of I can't remember how he puts it, but it's something along the lines of a nostalgia for something we've never seen or known. And so I guess to sum it up, that's a big part of who I've always been, but also a big part of what's behind my writing of Unfettered as well.
Mm-hmm. And you're in Australia right now, right?
Yep, that's right. It's the next day. I'm speaking to you from the future today.
Yeah, I think you said, as we spoke earlier, it's Thursday for us in Detroit, a little bit after 5 p.m. and it's Friday 7 a.m. or so for you.
Yep, and it's wintertime, which still is very mild. Right now the sun is out and the birds are singing, and it's probably about 60 Fahrenheit, so it's very mild winter.
When you get a chance to see the thumbnail I used for this video, I think you'll like it. It's some birds flying.
Oh, good. I look forward to that.
All right. So you mentioned that this book was one of your hardest books to write. And I guess I would have thought The Vulnerable Pastor would perhaps have been that. But you said this one was. So
Mm.
can you
Yeah, that
share a
was
little bit
saying,
about why this
yeah,
one was so challenging?
sure, yeah. Yeah, that was saying something because The Vulnerable Pastor was excruciating to write.
Mm,
And I think it took a lot of digging deep to work that out. But this book, Unfettered, was difficult in that personal wrestling kind of way, but also just in the pure act of writing. I had to rewrite it 4 times
yeah.
because there was something really powerful happening in me, but it was very, it felt very personal. It felt very difficult to explain or defend. And, but at the same time, it was wonderful. And, I work and live in a very academic context. And so I'm very aware of how we need to defend our theology and rationalize things. And I just knew that those experiences I was would not stand up to that kind of theological debate.
Hmm.
And so the first version of the book was like a very thorough logical argument for childlikeness, which just is inherently lacking in integrity.
It's very adultish.
Yes, exactly. And so, as people read it and they gave me that feedback, I think I was trying to protect myself and my experience, um, and thinking this is so important, and we have to do it in important ways, which is to have an argument for it. And and I actually went to a memoir writing workshop kind of by accident. I was just going to a writing workshop and realized on the day that it was about memoir. And I thought, I don't write memoir. Why would I go to this? And then it was only when I got there that I realized I think I am writing theology as memoir.
Hmm.
And and the speaker of the workshop said, this is hard work because you're bringing together 2 different things that don't usually come together. Not that I'm the only person who's done that, but it isn't a very common thing. And so from that point, that was a real turning point and a blessing to me. I think that's where I started writing the final version, and where I had to do the painful work of telling the story where it happened, which was in my own story, which
Hmm.
is a little bit too close for comfort sometimes. But I hope that it's a better version of itself because of it.
Yeah, I think for me, when I was going through your book, it really just helped me to see that this is really, I think, the best way for us to live out our Christian life, which is one where everything doesn't make sense necessarily, and where I think when we approach faith from the childlike sense that you mentioned, it actually allows us to be more playful, more vulnerable, more less controlling. I mean, I guess
Yeah,
that's really the
yeah,
word I think you use in a lot of ways, and I really love, and really more faithful. Tell you the truth, because we have
yes,
to
I think
depend
so.
on God a lot more, which is what children do.
Absolutely. I think it allows us to be human.
Yeah.
Uh, as children, I think we were just really comfortable with the joys and the limitations of human experience. And as we got to be adults, we pretended we could somehow overcome. We didn't need the joy, and we could overcome the limitation. And um, we miss out on the kingdom, I think, when we go to that place.
Hmm. So in your book, you mentioned 3 movements. You mentioned rest, receive, and respond. Can you please share about how each of these kind of help us live an unfettered life?
Yes. So I came to name our usual posture in a very productive Western culture, and this is for myself as well. We believe it's our job to fix things, and even if we say it's all up to God, or God is faithful, or God is carrying things, our postures and habits actually speak a different theology oftentimes, because as soon as there's a question or a crisis, we just have this respond kind of habit. And I see us kind of ping ponging. I do it too, between it's all up to God and it's all up to me, where we um, we think, well, God is the one holding the universe, and it's good theology to say it's all up to God. But then we still have to get out of bed and do something in the morning. And
Hmm.
so then once we engage, we jump into taking full responsibility again. And neither one of those has much requires much partnership with God. And so I say rest, receive, respond, because we do have a response. We do have
Right.
something that God is calling us into, and not a childish passivity. But it's just not the first thing. And by rest, I may mean 6 weeks off on sabbatical, or I may just mean taking a breath in a really stressful conversation, to say a quick prayer, or to just remember God is the one carrying this conversation. And so that abiding in the vine again, that connecting once more to the source of all flourishing and goodness, just for a moment to reposition ourselves. And from that place, I believe that requires a kind of emptying of our own power, of our own control, and our own understanding. And that moment of emptying, or that time, whatever time we're able to give it, of emptying, plugs us back into the source of all things, where we always receive something. It may not be what we were wanting.
Mm-hmm.
It may not look like, it may just be a different way of seeing things. It may be an permission to take longer than we thought we had to take. It may be a passage of scripture. It may be a word of encouragement. It may be a song. We always receive something if we are emptying of ourselves in order to connect back with God. And then that's our prompt to respond.
Mm-hmm.
And the response may be chill out, or the response may be engage. And so I say rest, receive, respond as an antidote to the respond, respond, respond kind of habit that we have, because then the response comes from a different place, and there's a freedom in it, and there's a partnership with God in it, which feels more like the kingdom than our usual habits.
Yeah, I appreciate all those aspects, because I think it seems like some of the books I've read recently are either on one spectrum or the other. Either it's discipleship, 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 or it's rest, 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 and it's like, really, it's a kind of all of those, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah,
think that,
it's a kind of a dance, you know.
mhm,
It's harder in some ways, because we have to be engaged with God and listen and respond, but that's what relationship is, you know.
mhm.
Um, I think in some ways we'd prefer if he had just given us a to-do list and left us alone. But then we'd never talk to him.
Right, right. So, in your estimation, what is the most glaring way that the Western church does kingdom things in empire ways?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the way that we're talking at the moment about leadership comes to mind for me. We've shaped our whole sense of how an organization is structured based on empire ways, or the world's ways of doing leadership and organization. And the sad thing for me is that as we are becoming aware of that, we're then saying, "Oh, well, so we don't have authority or leadership in the church anymore. That's been abused, so we're doing away with it entirely," which is still not the kingdom way. You know, in
Mhm.
the church, in scripture, it talks about Jesus astounded people with his authority. And he did call leaders to be with him and for him to disciple so they could disciple others. And so I think it's really healthy that we are becoming aware of the leadership structures that we've created and how they're not really very scriptural or spirit led. Um, what I wish we were doing was actually uncovering the system underneath that, and our own sin that's involved in that, and idolatry of our leaders. You know, it's easy to just kind of scapegoat the particular people who have maybe had abusive leadership, and I think it's good for us to call them to account. At the same time, until we are able to confess our own desire for leaders who are God to us, you know, no human being can sustain that kind of pressure, and
Sure.
whether it's going to break at some point, whether it means inappropriate behavior on their part, or just burnout on their part, or losing their faith, or whatever. Like, um, there are still boards of churches and entire congregations who have a leader like that, and then turn around and put someone else just like that in their place, someone who promises all the answers and to always be God for them, basically, in short, instead of saying, how can we find somebody who can help us, who can model for us what it means to need God and follow God. Until we confess our own idolatry in that, I don't think we're going to get very far. Um, but our response then should be to watch how Jesus had authority, and I would say he had authority in a way that was emptying of itself. Like he could speak on behalf of the Father because he gave so much of himself. He emptied himself of his own power and his own preferences in order to be obedient to the Father, and that gave him the permission and the authority to speak on behalf of the Father. Just like a parent has the authority. We may not always be right, but by goodness, we have the authority to speak into our children's lives, not because we're smarter, but because we've lost sleep for them, and we've cried for them and we've prayed for them, and that gives us permission to speak into their lives. So I think that's just one way that's really obvious at the moment as we're looking at how the church does leadership.
Mm-hmm. So a little bit of a different question. So like when you were in Ohio, pastoring at the University Christian Church, can you maybe give some examples of how you try to embody that? Or I don't know if this is something new that you've started, where you were obviously you were the leader in that respect, but you also not trying to be the idol for the individuals in the church. What does it
Right.
look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was really why writing The Vulnerable Pastor was so difficult and wonderful and difficult at the same time, because I hadn't really necessarily had that modeled for me. So I was trying to figure that out while I was in the job, which is, so I've made mistakes in it. But I think it was actually really freeing for me when I realized God was not calling me to have all the answers or to be the hope of these people, but to let people see how I was needing God. And so, interestingly, that place where I was tempted to say, "Oh, I shouldn't be a leader because I feel my need for God and I feel my inadequacy," that was actually a place to lead from in a way, to say that, it was okay for me to let people see that I needed God. Like, that's a way to model faith.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the position of leadership that actually often brings me to the end of myself and makes me see, like, I can't see the future. I can't answer all the questions. My heart is too small to carry all this pain of the folks in my community. And what I can do is each day wake up and ask the Lord, "What do you have for us?" And cry out to the Lord in prayer. And so I try to invite people into that with me, my leaders and my community, the congregation, as much as they, trying to also make a way that wasn't depending on them uh, for my own emotional and spiritual support. So it's tricky to navigate
Mm-hmm.
how to let people in behind the scenes but still be the leader. So that was one way that I was trying to experiment with a different way of doing it. And in many ways, I think it was really fruitful and a blessing to us all.
I think one of the key characteristics of understanding certain aspects of Scripture is perhaps understanding and living with ambiguity well.
Mm. Yeah, it's
And
uncomfortable though.
paradox, because it's kind of like opposites. You know what I mean? How
Yeah.
do you lead powerfully but be vulnerable? There's
Yeah,
many things like that in the Bible where it's kind of like they're opposites, and maybe that's the kind of heart God is trying to cultivate in us as part of
absolutely.
being kingdom people. We have to learn to kind of embrace that ambiguity.
Yeah, and it's living in that tension of clay vessels that house the spirit of the Lord of the universe. Like, that feels weird. And
Mm-hmm.
we feel our limitation, and we also feel this possibility that God's own spirit wants to communicate to the world through these clay vessels. And it's good to name the awkwardness and the discomfort of that and the beauty of that.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. So in your book, you address culture, obviously, and there are different cultures that we're trying to reach with the gospel. Can you please share about how each of these cultures, which would be the Western culture, which is kind of founded on, in a sense, guilt, it's a guilt culture, versus the Eastern culture, which is kind of based on the shame culture, how
Mm,
these both can impact us individually, and how we should then think about our evangelism?
yeah. Well, the interesting thing about that is that's been something that's been studied by global workers, missionaries over the years, but we are needing to know it for our own, even if we just stay put, in order to know how to share the gospel. Because we're discovering that some of the assumptions that we have in the ways that we share the gospel just aren't people's assumptions anymore, or the felt need that they have anymore. And so Tim Keller writes about how the premise that people feel far from God because of their sin, that used to be a place where people would start to share the gospel, just isn't the case anymore. They don't. It's assuming that people know God before we can tell them about God, which is really not getting us anywhere. And so we have to then tell people bad news of, by the way, you're a horrible sinner. And then so no wonder people don't want to hear from us, because we can't get to the good news because they're so sick of us judging them. And so, but there are felt needs that people actually do have that the gospel is good news to. And so it's really good for us to understand that some of these more Eastern kind of cultures, it's not so much that, part of that may be because of immigration or actual culture influence from East and West coming together. But a lot of it, I think, is that our culture itself is changing and finding more things in common with what would normally be called Eastern culture. And some of that is because of social media. The shaming that happens on social media is a part of and our sense of connection because of the internet. And so fundamentally, one of the main differences is that Western or guilt culture is very individualistic, and
Yep.
it's more transactional as well. It's like, I did a sin, and now I've broken a law, and I need the judge to release me from this charge. It's more institutional engagement, whereas in shame culture, it's more like, I've been put outside of the family because of something about me, and I need the family to receive me back into itself, which is classic kind of prodigal son story there, which is much more of a shame, and also more of a communal thing, that I need to be welcomed back into this community. And we see that operating in Asian cultures, but we also see that operating in traditions where there's like really big families too. You might think of the classic like Italian Catholic kind of context or something like that. And then we also start to see that in generations that are more engaged online and in social media and things like that too. So it's really good for us to be aware of the felt need. There is a sense of, I'm an outsider. I don't belong, and somebody has welcomed me in and given me a new identity and received me and seen me. That's the good news that they're looking for in that context. And so we can talk till we're blue in the face about guilt, but if they're not feeling that, then the good news is not going to be good news to them. And this is not a compromise of our theology, because those first apostles and evangelists in the New Testament had many ways of communicating the gospel to the different cultures that they were speaking to, and I think we need to learn from that.
So in your ministry, you would try to go through and identify kind of where people are at in terms of, are they more from this culture or that, or you just kind of had like a blanket way that captured both, or how would you approach that?
Yeah, I think it's more of, I don't necessarily like diagnose if they're Eastern or Western, but just try to be open to I think I want to just trust that all human beings ultimately are longing for union with our God. He is the creator of each of us, and there's something in us that is just made in his image, and every longing we have, every desire we have finds its beginning in that longing for connection with him and with one another as well. And so the East-West kind of language and honor, guilt and shame language gives me permission to expand my imagination and trust that there are even ways that just our empathy with people and our listening to people opens our eyes, opens our hearts and our imaginations to the places where they are longing for God, even though they might not call it that. Oftentimes they don't call it that. And that's why we have a job of coming alongside them and saying, oh, you know what, I call that longing for God, and here's what this looks like for me. And I think that's okay. There's a part of me that has been a bit afraid to do that because it feels like a compromise of our theology, and that we should just keep hammering the one thing over and over and over again. But we learn from missiology over the years and anthropology and from the first evangelists themselves that it's okay to be creative in those ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay. No, thank you. That's helpful. So in your book, you also explain that life can neither be, and you talked about this a little bit, maybe you can expound on this, all up to us as being, adults and being in control of everything, nor is it all up to God, perhaps being childlike and letting God take over and take control. But there's probably a third way that we should consider. Can you share about that a little bit?
Yeah. So you touched on that a little bit there, that in the beginning of my story, I had to wrestle with what I call adultishness, because we don't have that same distinction like we do with childish and childlike. So I had to create new words, adult-like and adultish too. So to be able to step into the release of my own power, I had to set aside my adultishness, which wants to be in power, to be able to be childlike in a way that is not ashamed of powerlessness. But the things that I received in that place prompted me to speak or to give or to serve in ways that were actually kind of scary. And this then reminded me of the stories in the Bible where we see God coming and inviting a person to be a prophet, and Jeremiah comes to mind where he says, "Oh no, I couldn't possibly do that. I'm just a child." And then we have this childish instinct that comes into play where we say, "Oh, I'm afraid now of being powerful." And this is where we need adult likeness, where we are unafraid of being powerful. And of course, it's limited power, but it still is. We still have agency. We have voices and gifts and resources to use for God. And so the "it's all up to me and it's all up to God" thing is often coming from adultishness and childishness. But what we're called into is childlike adult likeness, which means being unafraid of our powerlessness and also being unafraid of our powerfulness. So being aware that it's not all up to us, but we do have a part to play, and that actually in that mission in partnership with God, our God is a God who is on mission in the world, who's on adventure in the world, and he calls us to join with him in it. And that's where we build our relationship with him, to be looking for every sign of what he's doing and trying to say yes to it. And that is terrifying and wonderful at
Yeah.
the same time. I often wish there was a word for terrifying and wonderful. Exciting,
Faith.
terrified, excited, terrified,
How about faith?
Yep. That's a good, I love that. Yes.
Really, I think so, because when I went through your book, I mean, I was like, I live this out. That's really faith, because
Yeah,
if
you're
I'm trying
right.
to control everything, and it's two words actually, it's faith and wisdom, because you got to know
Mm,
when to be childlike and when to be adult-like. And if you
yes.
mix up the two, you're taking control when you shouldn't be taking control, and vice versa.
Yep.
So no, that's very, very helpful.
Yeah, that's true. It's good that you say that. I think there's a capacity that has to grow in us for just having the wisdom of knowing in the moment what is being called for here.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of that also is not having inhibitions in the wrong way, where we're so constrained, but we're kind of just listening to God more as he's directing us, one way or another. And I think that receiving, that second R that you mentioned, is crucial, in that really understanding how God is speaking to us, so we can really just be spirit-filled creatures. So thank you.
Mm.
So how has trying to live an unfettered life changed you and those who've read your wonderful book?
Mm. Well, I am hearing, going to the second part of that, I am hearing amazing feedback from readers so far, more than with anything else I've ever written. That, especially for those who are taking their time with it and actually doing the field guide experiments along the way. So because it's about engaging as whole beings, I realized the challenge of writing a book, because I'm basically saying we should engage with our whole selves, with our bodies and our emotions and blah, blah, blah. And meanwhile, you're sitting reading a book the whole time. And so I included a playlist for that reason. And I included
Yes.
some, which is really great musicians on there, by the way. Be sure to check that out. But I included these field guide experiments along the way as well, to invite people to actually experiment with some of these ideas and invitations. And the folks who are doing that are saying to me that this is deeply transformative, and more than anything I've ever written before, which is really encouraging for me, because I was a little bit worried that, how can I possibly communicate the ways this has been healing me and transforming me and terrifying me all at the same time. Yeah, I think, what was the first part of the question? You were asking about how it's affecting other people, but did you say how it affected me? Was that the first part?
Yes.
Yeah, as I said, I think in the beginning it was kind of scary to let myself listen to prompts that generally I would have set aside. So I'm not from a tradition that really has encouraged me to trust things that I couldn't explain, or listen to prompts that were mostly instinctive or emotional or embodied. And this was a part of the invitation, not to set aside intellect and rationality, but to just try to engage as the whole person that I am. Looking at stories like the Road to Emmaus, that all day long they talked to Jesus and they didn't realize, they didn't get it. And
Right.
it was when they had this embodied sensory experience and relational experience of eating together that their eyes were opened. And then they verified at the end by saying, weren't our hearts burning within us when we walked on the road with him? For us, if our heart is burning, that's a sign that mustn't be true, because that's just emotions or bodily experience. And so I suddenly started noticing how in scripture they were really comfortable with all those parts of themselves, with thinking and talking and feeling and engaging and relational, instinctive kinds of things. So in the beginning, that was really scary because what if it led me astray, and what if it was the beginning of my downfall, and it would be embarrassing. And I think I had to learn capacity for the discomfort. I often say, I'm not comfortable, but I'm getting used to the discomfort of pursuing things that make no sense to me. So even this move that we've just made across the planet to come back to Australia after 30 years, I couldn't really tell you. Like, there wasn't a clear sentence that dropped from the sky that said, here is why you are going and here's what you will be doing there. But on a kind of just a gut level, I had a sense that this was the right thing. And that's scary, to make such a huge life decision like that based on things that really I couldn't explain to you. But yeah, so I think it forces us to be really open to risk and open to adventure. And I think oftentimes the vibrant faith that we long for, that feels like it's real to us on a daily basis, can't be found in safe places. And so the sense of need for God is really felt because you are really putting yourself out there. And there have been times where I've sensed God saying, like, I'm putting myself out there too. Like, I'm not comfortable either. But for the joy set before him, Jesus pursued, he endured the suffering because there was something better that he had a vision of. And I want to have that much vision for the joy that's set before him as well.
So I know your husband is a New Testament professor. Has he been trying to be unfettered too, or?
Part of him is already a bit that way, and so I've learned from him in that way. So we've been working it out together. It looks different for different people, but yeah, it's been a good conversation for us to have. It brought up some arguments too. Some of these things are uncomfortable and bring a lot of baggage from our past, and that's the other thing that I would say if I said, how does it change? How's it changed me? That the Spirit doesn't really have a lot. He's compassionate for our baggage, but he also is so in love with the healing he has for us that he calls us to do things that force us to deal with some of that baggage. So my husband and I have had to have a lot of conversations about those things.
I hear you. All right. So you ready for the lightning round?
Yes, go.
All right. Okay. What's your favorite cuisine?
Thai food.
Okay. Got some good Thai food in Australia?
Yes.
Good deal. Your favorite film or series?
Arrival. It's a gem. Amy Adams. It's a kind of sci-fi movie, but it's also deeply emotionally satisfying.
Okay.
And has a lot of great spiritual themes in it. So I just watched it again this week. Watch it.
Okay. What's your morning routine?
It always begins with tea and then listening to a podcast called Pray As You Go, and then a walk, usually.
Okay.
Sometimes dancing. If I can't get outside, if it's raining, I'll just put on weird music and jump around in my pajamas.
Is that something you started doing more recently? You've done that for a while.
No, more recently. That was a part of the healing, I think, of just getting out of my head.
Oh, good deal.
Yeah, I talk about that in the book as well.
That's awesome. All right. What do you prefer, paper Bible or digital Bible?
Well, actually, my real preference is audio Bible. So I don't know if that's allowed to say that. But then for working, writing sermons and things, digital, but for reading, for enjoyment, paper Bible.
Okay. Is
But
there an
listening,
audio that you like?
yes.
Like a lot of.
Yes, I do have a favorite one. Bible Gateway has a whole list of different audio Bibles, and my favorite one is the NIV UK version read by David Suchet, who's actually an actor. If you're a PBS fan, he was Poirot in the PBS series, an Agatha Christie series. So he's amazing, and I think listening to scripture is a part of my practice to have a posture of receiving. As someone who's studied the Bible in an academic place, it's really good to just almost have it like a bedtime story that you're. And I think too, in the beginning, many of the first recipients of scriptures would have had it read to them.
True.
So I like receiving it in that way.
That's awesome. What's your favorite book of the Bible right now?
Probably Revelation, because it reminds me that in crisis, God is still faithful.
Okay. Was it Jeremiah at some point or no?
It has been that too through the reading of this book. Yeah. Through the writing of this book.
Got it. Who's your favorite Bible character?
Mary, I think.
Why is that?
She had to become like a child in order to do this really important thing. And I think I've heard her called the first disciple of Jesus. That
Okay.
she had to, we are all invited to be like Mary and to receive him into ourselves in that way, in a way that births him in the world.
Good deal. Outside of the Bible, what's your favorite book or author?
I have to say C.S. Lewis, and my favorite book of his is Till We Have Faces.
Yes, I think I heard you mention that on a podcast.
Yeah.
What book do you think everyone should read in the next 12 months? Besides yours, obviously.
Yes, of course. This is hard for me. I would say it's a toss-up for me between Edwin Friedman's work, A Failure of Nerve, which is about leadership and anxiety, or Walter Brueggemann's Prophetic Imagination. I think that one really resonates with this moment that we're in.
I think I have both of them on one of my lists.
Oh, great.
Of lists.
They're both really classics that I return to.
Good deal. Favorite place to live?
Well, this is a bit existential, but I would say wherever I am, because I've spent the last 30 years wishing to be back in Australia, and I am back in Australia, and it still has challenges. And so I'm learning to be, it's wonderful, and so many things have been resolved that we've missed. I think ultimately, we'll never really be home until we're home in God. And that's a bit of a cliche, I know, but my commitment is to be present wherever God places me, and to just try to be at home in the place where He's putting me.
Mm-hmm. I hear you. Where do you most want to visit?
I would love to go to, there's a medieval abbess called Hildegard of Bingen, and she's known for her music and her art and her writing. She was a mystic and a doctor of medicine and nature, and she founded 2 abbeys in Germany. And I would love to go. There's one of them that still stands. If I could go there, and also for her music to be performed there at the same time. I assume they do that there sometimes. That would be, definitely a highlight of my life if I could get there one day.
You know who I really inspired by is George Muller.
Who?
George Muller of Bristol.
Oh,
Mueller.
I don't think I know that one.
He basically took care of 10,000 orphans in the late
Oh,
19th century.
yes, okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
no, is this a man of faith? I think he was very childlike in that sense. If I just look at his
Huh.
faith and just dependence on God, and just wow. Okay. If you could place a billboard in the middle of your city, what would it say?
It would say nothing. It would just be blank space, maybe with a little word that said like breathe or something like that. Just like, an invitation to not bombard people with more stuff.
Got it. So you mentioned a playlist as we wrap it up. Where can people find that playlist and also learn more about you and your ministry?
Yeah, you can go to my website, which is thewayistheway.org, and on the Unfettered page there is the playlist link and other things connected to the book, and also links to buy the book. And you'll find information there about my other books and writing and blog posts and things like that as well. Thewayistheway.org.
Okay. And you had a conference recently. Is that are there recordings of that? Or?
I don't think they're going to be making that available just yet. I think the registrants just received the link for it today. But if it does become openly available, I'll be sure to put that up.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much for your time.
Yeah,
I do
thanks for
want
having
to,
me.
before we close out, just encourage those who watch this episode to subscribe to the channel so we can continue to grow and reach more individuals with some great guests and great news that's out there. And also want to give a great shout out to my friend Virgidine, who supports this program in great ways. She's my book BFF. So thanks again for your time.